Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry. I'm a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. All right, this video came across my timeline and the title sounded very interesting because it's called The Tiananmen Square Massacre Never Happened. So this is from a channel I've never reacted to called Hakim. I do notice though that his profile picture has, I think, Lenin in it. I don't know if that means we're coming from a Leninist, communist background, but it doesn't matter because it's important to hear the arguments. However, you don't want to be the type that just believes the last thing that you heard. All right, but we'll be checking this out in just a second here. This video is going to be linked down below. Shout out to my YouTube channel members and Patreon pledgers. YouTube channel members, you got to see this video first. You also see over there some of the demonetized content that I haven't put out publicly. So if you want to join, there's some incentive too. Let's get started. Now we'll see if this is actually a hot take or not, because you are saying something, generally speaking, with how people have perceived the Tiananmen Square massacre by saying it never happened. Usually you hear that type of rhetoric, come from official Chinese kind of messaging, but we'll see what's going on here. Let's see. Is there some evidence out there, or some of the evidence that we've been familiar with? Is it bad? These are the types of things we ask ourselves about all historical events. But let's see what they got. We could be on Tiananmen Square, another view of Tiananmen. Okay, he's got some sources there.
What should we do?
Let me see what those sources were. It's always nice. Oh, recommended reading. Okay, recommended reading is, so from the site, looks like it's FRSO, Revolution, Socialism, Liberation. Looking back at Tiananmen Square, the defeat of counter-revolution in China. Interesting. So they're saying the protests at Tiananmen Square in 1989 were counter-revolutionary. That's a term that you will hear. Revolutionary movements, or things that are the product of a revolutionary movement, whether it's communist or it's something like the French Revolution, you will hear counter-revolution. And those are the people against the revolution, that way. So it looks like, okay, there's an article you could check out. What's this one? There was a second one here, redsales.org. I don't know that background, but another view of Tiananmen. Okay, here we go.
The students keep asking, what should we do next? What can we accomplish? I feel so sad. Because how can I tell them that what we are actually hoping for is bloodshed? For the moment when the government has no choice but to brazenly butcher the people. Only when the square is awash with blood will the people of China open their eyes. Only then will they really be united. But how can I explain any of this to my fellow students? And what is truly sad is that some students and some famous, well-connected people are working hard to help the government, to prevent it from taking such measures.
This is Chai Ling, the self-declared supreme leader of the Tiananmen Square protests. We'll get back to her soon.
Oh, interesting. I've never heard of her individually.
Tank Man is usually presented to Western audiences as some regular, brave guy standing up to a ruthless, authoritarian regime. What you're not told is that A, these are tanks leaving the square, and the man is standing in their way, and B, that there is video footage of this event, and what is always implied, that this man is ran over by the tank, never happened. Instead, he climbs atop, opens the hatch, and starts chatting with the soldiers. In popular media,
That's true, though. Like, context was important there, because, this is such an iconic image, but, yeah, you're not necessarily told where the tanks were going, going. A lot of people didn't know, though, that he did climb up on them and stuff like that. But I don't think we even know who the guy was. We don't even know interview or what his politics were. But the narrative definitely has been he's standing up to the tanks, right? And during this protest. But yeah, we don't know anything about him.
That he climbs atop, opens the hatch, and starts chatting with the soldiers. In popular media, the widely recognized narrative of the Tiananmen Square massacre is typically presented as follows. In June of 1989, the Chinese government imposed martial law and deployed the military to quell a pro-democracy and freedom protest.
Again, I don't know how much history is going to be involved in this. You may want to check out some other stuff so we don't have to spend too much time on the background of what the Tiananmen Square massacre was. There's plenty of stuff out there, but, might be interject you some history throughout the way, especially if it's some things that probably need to be brought up. But
led by students, troops and tanks entered Tiananmen Square and opened fire on unarmed protesters, resulting in the deaths and injuries of hundreds, if not thousands, of people.
That's the
Some of the more exaggerated.
I believe the Chinese government say it was around 200. but so many other sources are they're huge on it. I've seen other sources go to like 800 up to like 10,000. So it's it's very wide.
Exaggerated versions of the story include claims of tanks crushing students and machine guns being fired into the crowd, with bodies littering the square. All of the above is a lie. It never happened. So what did? Back to the video.
Interesting. Okay, we'll see what he's going to talk about. I mean, I've seen what's at least supposed to be the media footage. You can see like the BBC had footage of the firing going on, as well as injured people, going into the like people that were shot and stuff going into the hospitals, the footage out there. But yeah, saying that it's a lie or never happened. This should be interesting. It's going to have to be, I think, a lot of debunking for this.
Okay, first some background. Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms in the late 70s shook up China's economy by introducing free market reforms, creating large gaps between the rich and poor, unsurprisingly.
Now, Deng was an economic reformer. It also put him at odds with some of the people inside of the party there. And because there were people that were, like Mao dies in the late 70s and people wanted to stick straight to kind of like carrying out his wishes. But then there were people like Deng who were still down with, a lot of the ideas, especially like culturally, that went along with maybe Mao and the communist narrative, but like wanted economic reforms. They saw the economic problems that came from things like Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution and wanted to change those things. And yeah, it got a little bit more free market into it.
And bringing with it some very blatant forms of corruption. These reforms likewise scaled back welfare programs and relaxed price controls. This massively benefited Chinese farmers, of which there are a lot, and led to increased crop yields and spending by them, which, predictably in a market economy, caused inflation, mostly affecting urban dwellers. Students and urbanites expressed a certain sense of superiority, you could call it, over rural citizens. And we're not happy to see peasants...
Well, and that's what the Cultural Revolution was about this urban elite versus the agricultural elite, and saying that we can't have that. You can't have these it's literally different social classes that way. Cultural Revolution in the 60s was about trying to bring people to that level of, supposed equality, but it did have massive effects because those urban elite you're talking about, those were people, for example, like myself, like teachers. There were professors, teachers, and a lot of them were basically removed from their positions. Schools closed. That's, by the way, one of the things that a lot of people were clamoring for in the 1980s in China was need to start opening those up because it did have an impact on the quality of education and things like that in China.
And farmers do better than them, even less so foreigners. Following cuts to tuition subsidies, students began protesting the presence of African exchange students. Like most foreign students, the Africans enjoyed greater standards of living in China, and some dated local women. Among
Interesting, I did not know about.
At Heihai on Christmas Eve, 1988, were placards demanding greater democracy, alongside ones proclaiming "Death to the Black Devils."
Oh,
I don't think you've ever seen this in any of the commemorations.
I don't know if he's trying to like paint the students as like racist that way, but saying that Africans enjoy greater standards of living in China. I'd be interested to know what those standards were. I did not know a lot about like foreign Africans going into China for education that way. Were those countries that had ties somehow to China or to communist states at the time in the 1980s?
Political discussion
Why would you be going there?
Was very complex and spanned the entire political spectrum, of course. That's not surprising. China is a massive country. The liberal narrative, though, centers on Hu Yaobang, a popular reform leader who at that point had been a key advocate for political liberalization within the Chinese government. His sudden death on April 15, 1989, sparked student protests, as many within that particular movement saw his demise as the end of a hope for Western-style liberal political reform. In the following days, the China Democratic Alliance, a U.S.-based...
You're not going to... So, like, with Deng, you're not going to see him become the political reformer. He was the economic reformer. And that was one of the big dividing issues, especially after Mao died, was people that wanted reforms, but, like, are they going to be political? Are they going to be economic? There was a lot of varying opinions at that time.
Organization, which wanted the outright establishment of capitalism in China, issued an open letter to Chinese university students, which was posted at many Beijing schools at the time, advising that the complete negation of the anti-liberalization movement of 1987 should be used as a breakthrough point. For those that can't read between the lines, this is a subtle call for regime change from a foreign government.
Now, I think it's super important to discuss the larger context of what's going on in the late 80s. The late 1980s, this is when a lot of people around the world felt that communism was in its it's in its final downward spiral. The Soviet Union was collapsing. You're getting these protests that are going to start to happen here. You're going to see them in Poland. Berlin Wall is going to fall a few months after the Tiananmen Square massacre. It was that era. It was like communism and its ideas and motivations were on its final leg there. And this movement, I would consider what's happening here as a part of that, wanting more pro-democracy, political reforms, continued economic reforms. There's a larger context of a movement that was going on globally within communist states.
How fun. Regardless, students of a particular class background began to gather in Tiananmen Square to mourn Hu Yaobang and voice their frustrations with the government. This subsection of protesters, which the Western press overwhelmingly focused on, demanded, on paper, Western-style democracy, government accountability, and civil liberties like freedom of the press and speech, largely inspired by Hu. In reality, their interests were different and their demands
Hu, from what I understand, was kind of pushed out a lot during his career. He ended up dying like a heart attack, I think, later. But like, yeah, people used his death to, prop up his ideas and saying he was being, suppressed by the party for these popular ideas that these students and especially young people had.
Different. These weren't representatives of the collective will of China, but
Beijing, by the way,
a layer of the intelligentsia who wanted to be elevated and given more privileges, such as more political power and higher wages in their subsequent careers. When workers organized alongside them, students treated them with contempt. Despite their alliance on the square, educational and class differences continually hampered their relations. These students were not, after all, Lao Baixing, meaning common people. They exhibited awareness about the articulation of economic demands by other groups and wanted to keep the movement exclusively under their control. They would go on to cordon off their marches from those who weren't students or so-called intellectuals afterwards. What started as a small gathering...
So, I was wondering if he's saying that these groups were trying to emerge as some kind of elites out of Chinese society.
And grew into a larger protest, with up to 1 million people joining in, though that was only at the very height. Towards the end of the protests, it would have been less than a tenth of that.
The protest was from like April all the way to beginning of June, so it was, month and a half.
Set up makeshift camps, organized speeches, and created posters and banners displaying a wide variety of political positions, many of which including differing flavors of Marxism. Interesting that student encampments in the US aren't very popular politically. That can't possibly be hypocrisy. Anyways, despite the festive atmosphere, there was an underlying tension, and on April 19th, a number of protesters attempted to storm Zhongnanhai, the headquarters of the party. This, along with certain very clear calls for the overthrow of the government by liberal student leaders, got the government's attention, unsurprisingly.
I'm wondering if he, just like thinking about where his thesis is going to be going here, is he one that's going to be against these student protests? In there he was talking about pro-Palestinian protests, and it seems like he's on the side of those. But is he going to see these people as different? Usually when it comes to revolutionary people that really espouse the revolutionary ideas, we usually side with the young, protests of students, usually saying that they're consistently on the right side of history. And I wonder if he's going to be doing that with these students here.
Including a struggle within the party itself increased the seriousness of the movement more than the students themselves had realized. It would take an hour to go over the specifics, so refer to the articles at the beginning of the video if you're interested. Regardless, martial law was declared over the area, but troops failed to arrive in Tiananmen Square in the middle of May because of roadblocks the students had set up around the city.
It was huge, up to 1 million people.
Had orders to avoid violent confrontations, particularly with the students. It was difficult to enter the city as planned. Despite
you would see in a protest like this in the United States, you would see military police force there to, whether it's keep the peace, not necessarily disperse them. Here in the United States, we have laws about protests and how you can do them legally, but you're not going to have those sorts of things there in China. So those military forces are going to be able to, use more force and, do whatever they think means keeping the peace.
Law regulations, though, the Chinese media allowed Western press to continue to make use of its transmission facilities. So much for a dictatorship, I guess. On May 27th, the Federation of College Students
saying
decided
they were not
to represent their movement with a symbol,
anyway.
which was a plaster reconstruction
There was foreign press
of, not, the Statue of Liberty in Tiananmen Square. As if you needed any more information about where their ideological underpinnings lie. All this will become clear very soon.
French Revolution, United States.
About how they wish this would anger the Chinese leadership, and in vague terms may have even ordered it. How about some more proof?
By the way, I don't know where Hakim, I don't know if that's him talking necessarily, but where he's from, let me know if you know.
A major protest leader who just 1 year prior called for the outright overthrow of the Chinese government, the institution of complete market reforms, and the replacement of Chinese culture with modern culture, read Western culture, that's what he meant, would arrive back in China from New York just in time for the protests, and would now call for armed struggle against the Chinese government. His reverse weeabooing for the West doesn't stop there, by the way. He's on record saying it would take 300 years of colonialism to transform China. In 100 years of colonialism, Hong Kong has changed to what we see today. With China being so big, of course it would require 300 years as a colony for it to be able to transform into how Hong Kong is today. I have my doubts as to whether 300 years would be enough.
That's interesting. 300 years, though? That seems like a little bit hyperbolic that way. I mean, obviously Hong Kong is a lot smaller than China, but I mean, the British ruled it for over 100 years. Hong Kong is a very different place than a lot of mainland China. You probably hear about all the time. That has a lot more of this liberal ideas and has often make them come in conflict with the mainland, Chinese government. 300 years, I mean, we'll see, but it is different. I mean, but there's so much cultural change that has happened in colonialism. Look at, comparatively, the closest thing you compare to China would say probably be like India, which had a lot of transformations under British occupation. And that was not nearly 300 years. Their direct rule only really started in the mid-1800s and lasted about 100 years. Now, before that, you did have indirect rule through like the British East India Company and things like that. But anyway, I don't know if it takes 300
years. Of June, following 2 months of on and off.
It's just that the thing is, though, imperialism doesn't work very well in China. It hasn't worked very well in China. The Chinese have put up fights against that. Going back to ancient China, China is always actively trying to preserve its culture ever since ancient times. But it doesn't mean there haven't been foreign influences. There have been repeatedly throughout history.
Troops slowly made their way into Beijing. A number of these troops moved towards Tiananmen Square. The troops continued their negotiations and almost reached an agreement with the students that would have ended the protests. But this was sabotaged by the more radical, violent elements of those same liberal protest leaders looking for a fight, not a solution. On the morning of June 3rd, more attacks were made on military vehicles. Reporters for Time magazine stated, by 7 a.m. though, students and young workers outside Zhongnan High were smashing their way into 2 military buses filled with light machine guns and crates of ammunition. As for isolated pockets of troops hemmed in at the intersections and overpasses around the city, the crowd was not in a mood to merely lecture them. In some places, the troops were stripped almost naked, chased or struck by angry citizens. Other injured troops had difficulty getting to hospitals as mobs deflated or slashed the tires of military ambulances.
Anyone else getting like storming of the Bastille vibes on the eve of the French Revolution? Where this is happening. But again, I don't know if he's saying who's in the right here, who you would say is in the right. With the difference being you have this monarchy in France, that's the status quo there and had been for centuries. But then you have the Communist Party that's in control of China. Does that then mean that it changed, since it's different who is in charge, that then changes who is in the right when it comes to who is protesting? So I'm wondering if, under this idea, you would say like, okay, those people in the French Revolution were justified, but those protesters in China were not justified.
This isn't the least of it. I'm not going to show any of the footage, but the violence reached such a point that unarmed soldiers were burned alive. Some calculations have up to half the dead being PLA soldiers trapped in their armored personnel carriers,
like
buses and
Bastille,
tanks, as the vehicles were torched. Others were killed and brutally mutilated by protesters with various implements. These events that actually happened are instead overshadowed by mythical tanks running over people in tents, which never happened. Only after this did the government respond with violence in turn.
Tanks did come in. I guess you're arguing whether some of the use of that may be different than what had happened. I mean, there's a ton of tanks came in, but yeah, were they just running over people? I don't know exactly a lot about like if it said that tanks were opening fire necessarily with that. We know there was a lot of gunfire for sure, but in the way that you would think of a tank with this huge artillery, coming out of it. So anyway, that one I'd have to brush up on a little bit as far as what has been reported about the tanks, as far as things other than just like running over people.
In the troops which remained outside Beijing at 6:30 on the night of June 3rd. The announcement was made around Beijing that people should remain in their neighborhoods and stay away from Tiananmen Square. Around midnight, soldiers stationed about 3 miles west of the square are said to have started firing indiscriminately at unarmed civilians in the streets. Chang'an Boulevard in particular became the scene of intense and brutal confrontations. People staying at the Beijing Hotel, close to the square, reported seeing troops open fire on unarmed citizens who were too far away to pose any real threat. This is, however, countered by other Western reporting and comments from protesters that said no indiscriminate firing ever occurred. Estimates suggest that between 200 and 300 people...
So indiscriminate firing, so saying that there was fire, though, but saying what it was in defense or something, that these people were, attacking the soldiers. Again, I mean, if you want to just declare the video fake, some of the foreign press showed a lot of the victims of the firing and showing them, bloodied, and again, they'd been shot or whatever, and were going into the hospitals. So, all right, it's throwing up a number. I'll go back 5 seconds.
Protesters that said no indiscriminate firing ever occurred. Estimates suggest that between 200 and 300 people, both civilian and military, were killed during these confrontations.
That's the Chinese government.
A lot of the violence happened as troops tried to push through the barricades and crowds. As for the square itself, a Taiwan-born singer and composer, Hou Dejian, who joined the student protesters at the square and negotiated with the Chinese army commissar, said, "During the whole withdrawal process, I didn't see a single student, other citizens, or soldiers killed in the square, nor did I see any armored troop carriers rolling over people." Richard...
I wonder what the timing of that was with those negotiations that day and where it took place. But well, he did say, I guess it was in Tiananmen Square. But man, saying it never happened, I would like to know some more context, especially because of that statement versus then all of the other statements. You know what I mean? One statement doesn't trump a bunch, tons of other ones.
Ross from CBS News reported being held by Chinese troops while driving through the square and didn't see any bodies or signs of a massacre. Additionally, James Miles, BBC's Beijing correspondent, said, "There was violence in Beijing, but no massacre in the square itself." Accounts from diplomats are very similar. A Chilean diplomat inside the square noted that while there were sporadic gunshots, most troops had non-lethal gear like batons and clubs.
Then you hear, some reporters say the other one. So I don't know if this is cherry picking some of them. I'm really not. I'm honestly not. But I don't know if this is insinuating that these were the only reports that came out and they all said that these things didn't happen.
This particular diplomat's account supports the view that there was no mass shooting in the square itself. Even US embassy cables, later released, or unwillingly released by WikiLeaks, confirmed that the worst violence happened outside the square, especially at Mushidi, 3 miles west. These accounts from a diverse set of people and motivations challenges this widely held belief that there was a massacre within Tiananmen Square.
I don't know if this is, I guess it's not really moving the goalpost or saying, so is the argument that no massacre happened, or just the argument that it didn't happen at Tiananmen Square?
The Chinese government always claimed no one was killed in the square, but they don't deny the serious violence and deaths that occurred in the surrounding areas.
They've said there's a couple hundred
These
dead.
reports from Western diplomats and journalists back that up. The Chinese government's account of the events was initially dismissed as propaganda, of course, but turned out to be more or less correct. They reported about 300 deaths, which is true, including many soldiers of the PLA. In contrast, Western sources seem to...
the government said 200. Again, the other sources... again, I've gone all the way to 10,000. I have no idea about the reliability of those other ones, but from like 800 to, it could be 800, but also like, again, 10,000. I don't know the reliability specifically about who said 800 and who said 10,000. I have to look more into that.
Decide at random what the death toll was. They claimed and still claim that thousands had died, ranging from 2,600 to as high as 10,000 people. Nicholas Kristof from the New York Times suggested, basically by guessing, that about a dozen soldiers and policemen were killed, along with 400 to 800 civilians. On the 12th of June, 1989, the New York Times published an exhaustive but entirely fabricated eyewitness report describing brutal mass killings in the square. Eyewitness accounts and later investigations, though, revealed that the Chinese government's claims were basically correct.
I mean, some of the imagery I have seen wasn't necessarily, at the square itself, but you're talking about a dispersing of thousands of people in lots of different directions.
These inflated numbers and presentation were a part of a concerted effort by Western media to craft a very particular narrative, the typical brutal authoritarian regime committing horrific crimes against humanity. True. Because the leadership of a particular country isn't a US puppet. And
true. I mean, what he's saying here, he's saying could be an inherent bias of the media to portray things in a certain way. Context is important. This is the Cold War. This is the era when Western countries were really sticking it to these communist regimes around the world because they were seemingly failing. And there was support within those countries. Again, Soviet Union comes to mind, and their satellite states and allied states. So this was definitely a time where it was like hitting them while they're down, for sure.
And Western capital can't exploit local labor to the fullest while also stripping the country of all its natural resources for cheap. Israel never gets this kind of coverage in the American press. Why is that? I wonder. And if the West just making stuff up about the incident
the
wasn't
Manifest
enough to
Destiny
completely discredit the grand
picture.
myth they built, actually existing evidence in the form of aerial photos of the conflict zone showed over 100 military trucks and armored vehicles torched, lynched PLA soldiers, and, most shockingly of all, demonstrators actually stripping the automatic rifles off of soldiers who put up no fight. Yes, seriously. It tells a wildly different story insofar as telling the truth about the incident is concerned. But do you see just how far from the truth the Western telling of the story is? Well, if you've been keeping up with the news at all...
I mean, both can be true. Both things can be true. They're not mutually exclusive. Protesters could have been very violent with those soldiers there. And then some soldiers may have been very violent with the protesters.
Oh, this should be any surprise to you. This is an important
Brings up
note.
Gaza and
Many
Israel
of
a
those
lot.
killed by the
Trying
army
to
were in
compare
the
'em.
western part of Beijing and on the way to the square, not in it. This may sound like a distinction without a difference, but it's not. Tiananmen Square is enclosed enough that the image conveyed by claiming there was a massacre in the square is one of shooting fish in a barrel, which is to say that it implies the soldiers were just blindly shooting into a restricted mass of people, which is horrific, but isn't what happened.
Okay, so he's trying to say that it does matter that if it happened in the square or not. I guess I mean, the geography of the square there is this huge open area, again, that would be like shooting fish in a barrel there. So he's saying it does matter. I was kind of insinuating before that, like, how much does it matter where it physically took place? What it was really, again, the message supposed to be about this oppressive government that was trying to, annihilate a peaceful, pro-democratic protest.
Now, the Tiananmen Square massacre has become a massive Mandela effect moment, a collective false memory, pushed by Western media despite numerous reports and eyewitness accounts to the contrary.
Well,
so
I don't know
what really
call it
happened?
Mandela effect.
Well, for starters, this protest was not as spontaneous as it appeared. In the days leading up to
I was saying it's Mandela effect is when you remember something that didn't happen, but like there was never this memory that it was, like, at least in the foreign world, that it was this peaceful, this thing ended up being peaceful and there was a resolution to it and there wasn't this massacre. That was never, I think, the memory. The memory has always been that it was this massacre. But I mean, that's, neither here nor there.
confrontation, the US government was actively involved in promoting the pro-democracy protests through a well-funded, internationally coordinated propaganda machine, much of which came from Voice of America. The protests were also not
CIA?
one ideological trend, but representative of a broad spectrum from working-class Maoists upset with Deng's reforms
Wouldn't be the
to
first.
liberal urban elites hoping that political reform would bring with it asset speculation and Western-like managerial salaries, and to hell with democracy if it suited them. Guess which section the Western press focused on? Where Kai-shi, a leader of the protests, said it in even plainer terms. So, what do we want? Nike shoes, lots of free time to take our girlfriends to the bar, the freedom to discuss an issue with someone and get a little respect from society.
Yeah.
Lofty ideals, clearly. The
Nikes.
soldiers, who were not given any orders upon arriving on the scene, entered the square on June 4th, 1989. They didn't swarm in, guns blazing. No, instead, a small group of soldiers showed up, unarmed, and spoke with student leaders. More troops arrived, and negotiations were eventually interrupted by violence called for from liberal radicals in the crowd, who would go on Western interviews calling for bloodshed because it was supposedly the only thing that would bring change.
That's what the French revolutionaries said too. I mean, when you have a protest this size, there's going to be different people with different ideas about what it's going to look like. There's no way you can get that many protesters on the same page. There are going to be people that are like, yes, it's with blood, and there's people like, no, we can negotiate. Like there's going to be some bad apples, I guess you would say. You know, a lot of people bring that up about like January 6th, right? There's these protesters, right, that are going to the Capitol, and a lot of them had no intention of, like entering the Capitol and actually like hanging politicians and stuff like that. But then there were, some that were like, yeah, bloodthirsty or whatever, trial by hanging or whatever they were saying. Yeah, it's just what happens when you have large groups of people that are upset.
So again, while most people were there in good faith and looking for mild reforms, people like Chai Ling, that you saw in the beginning of the video, had ulterior motives. She admitted in an interview that the goal was to provoke the government into a violent crackdown with the hope that it would topple the Communist Party. Oddly similar to the desires of the US, I couldn't possibly understand why. She not only called for bloodshed, but thought that she herself was too important and that she should leave the square should any violence happen. How quaint. She's also on tape talking racist nonsense about how the Chinese aren't worth the effort. Additionally, reports from the time describe how these liberal anti-government fighters were highly organized and grouped themselves into formations of 100.
Is this poisoning the well kind of thing happening here? I mean, they're definitely using her as saying, well, she's this racist, bloodthirsty person. Is that supposed to be poisoning the whole movement to say it's all like that?
People around the square, not inside it. They armed themselves with Molotov cocktails and iron clubs to use against the still unarmed PLA. Once the confrontations escalated, the deaths began, starting with dozens of soldiers and later protesters. Want to know the most interesting bit? A fanciful documentary titled The Gate of Heavenly Peace was made in the 90s, of course funded by the US government, Ford, and the Rockefeller Foundation. In it, they rehash the liberal mythology of what happened, but within the interview,
the three heads of Western imperialism.
which they're trying to use to support the fictitious series of events, the protest leaders admit to, amongst other things, 1. Foreign funding and support, 2. The desire to overthrow the government, 3. Political suppression of liberals by other liberals within the protests themselves, so much for democracy, 4. Them admitting to lying about bloodshed on the square, and specifically the tanks rolling over people part, 5. Weird racism about Chinese people not being ready for democracy, not having the brain for it, and other cringe, and finally, 6. Wanting to instigate as much state violence as possible.
Now, there's some truth to this. If you're talking about what we've learned about like CIA activities and intelligence agencies coming out of the West, especially with the United States, every single one of those things that he just talked about all have historical precedent to them.
From the get-go. By the way, remember
the whole Western world would love to see the regime, would have loved to see the Western regime, or sorry, the Chinese government regime fall. Like, that's like no doubt. Still Cold War era. There's still this ideological war going on.
Earlier, he's a proven liar as well. He had claimed to have seen 200 students cut down by gunfire at the square, but it was later proven that he left the square several hours before the events he described allegedly occurred.
How much does it matter what this guy says?
According to the Columbia Journalism Review, all verified eyewitness accounts clearly stated that the students who had remained in the square when troops arrived to clear them had all been allowed to leave the square peacefully. About foreign support. The movement received both financial and moral support from various international sources,
doubt about that.
Particularly the United States. Newspapers and organizations in the US, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the UK were publishing false reports and providing outside financial support to the movement.
For sure.
Now, this wouldn't be a proper US-backed attempted coup or color revolution if we didn't talk about the Voice of America.
Now,
Voice of America was...
The United States, though, has been far more successful at something like that. I don't think this would have ever worked in the way that the United States would have hoped it would have. Like, would this actually have brought down this like massive regime change? I don't know. There's usually other elements that the United States has used that would probably be a lot more successful, but no, maybe they thought it would be successful.
Was pumping out propaganda at an incredible speed, increasing its Chinese language broadcasts to 11 hours daily, with the specific goal of creating confusion and panic not just among Chinese citizens, but soldiers as well. Sensational.
Well, let's remember too, pumping money into it. But the United States was doing that all over the place after World War II. The United States would love, to have like China be this capitalist nation that they could do an insane amount of business with. Think about the untapped markets at that time with China. Now, in the 80s, China was economically becoming more liberal and there was more foreign trade going on, but still, it was still at the behest of and with the approval of the governments. The United States and capitalists in the United States would love to be able to direct or to do business directly with business owners and factory producers in China without the government getting involved there. They would love to have that. That's why the United States is going to prop up places like Japan after World War II and Western Germany. They want economic partners.
Pushed, such as soldiers were firing on other soldiers and that key government figures had been killed.
Heard that.
This was designed to portray the Chinese government as chaotic and violent and to spur further instability. Western journalists, ever so honest, made sure to portray the students as noble and idealistic, focusing on acts of generosity by people in Hong Kong and elsewhere who sent material support to the students, but made no...
Well, he just said that most of them were, though. He did say most of the people were. It was just those handful that he kept showing individually.
No mention of American propaganda channels working overtime on the students. There's also some anecdotal evidence of the CIA providing material and support to the protesters, in a similar pattern to the
Would not be
support they gave
surprised.
Eastern European counter-revolutionary movements. But I didn't include it here because it's not as concrete as I would like. At least not yet. This stuff will come out eventually.
Interesting.
What we do
I thought he'd go right to it and use it as a major source there because it does have so much historical precedent there.
know is that the inventor
must be
of the
really
concept
weak
of
then, I don't know.
American-backed color revolutions, Gene Sharp, was at Tiananmen Square during the protests. Sharp's co-worker, Colonel Robert Helvey, had also trained in Hong Kong the student leaders from Beijing in mass demonstration techniques, which they were to subsequently use in the Tiananmen Square incident of June 1989. He would later go on to train Falun Gong in China in similar civil disobedience techniques. Following the crackdown through Operation Yellowbird, many of the student leaders escaped to the United States with the help of the CIA or other intelligence, where almost all of them gained privileged positions. I wonder why. They became either conservative.
Well, they'd be an incredible asset to the United States to have somebody like that. To have somebody like that they can market as somebody that lived through the horrors of, communism. They love doing that. U.S. did that a lot with all the former communist states. They love that stuff. They want connections. You have allies in places where you are seen as an enemy.
Media heads, investment bankers, hedge fund managers, political appointees, or other rewards for what
Makes
they
sense.
have
Those
done.
guys were
Imagine the inverse for a second.
pro-capitalism.
Massive protests in the US, sponsored by the Chinese.
it's not gonna work
where
in China.
afterwards, every major protest leader is smuggled out of China to China, living privileged and comfortable lives afterwards. Really gets the critical thinking going for a second. The myth of the Tiananmen Square massacre is one of the West's favorite rallying cries to defend the democracy, and in the words of Noam Chomsky, the uniformity and obedience of the media, which any dictator would admire, push it dutifully. A few years earlier, in the spring of 1980, the US-backed military dictatorship of the Republic of Korea put down the Gwangju democratization movement, with an estimated dead of up to 2,000 people. In the beginning of 1989,
Yeah,
just months
that doesn't
before
get talked
Tiananmen
about.
Square, the US-backed right-wing Venezuelan government of Carlos Andres Perez squashed protests that lasted 9 days, where up to 1,000 people were slaughtered by the Venezuelan military. To quote the Red Sails article I recommend you read, "It should strike us as strange that these comparable incidents are not taught to anyone in the West, let alone commemorated in a yearly fashion. Could it possibly be because they don't actually care about freedom and democracy?" Yes, it's absolutely that. The reason
It is
the
a
Tiananmen
Lenin-
Square event is
It is a Lenin head.
freedom and democracy. Yes, it's absolutely that.
So I'm wondering if he's also, if the consistency is in his system and the way he believes is not necessarily that all protests against the government are valid. It's just the bad ones are, or the good ones are protests that are against capital. Probably, if he really is more of a Leninist and subscribes to a lot of forms of communist ideology, and that's probably the case. That, yeah, it's not about, just defaulting, protesting the government. Large protests especially are good regardless of the system in place, but protests aren't always good, especially if they are going to be ones that are pro-capital.
The reason the Tiananmen Square event is propagandized to this level is because China is a geopolitical enemy of the US, not by choice, but because they dare to grow their economy on their own merits and to eventually challenge the US's unipolar domination on the earth. For the leftists listening, read section 5 of the Red Sails article. Since China has been
I wonder what he
slandered
would.
so much
I wonder what he thinks about the solidarity movement in Poland. I'd be interested to know what he thinks about that.
over an incident that didn't happen, as popularly believed,
I would think he's
and since
probably
the US
more
is the
for it.
main culprit in the creation and perpetuation of the myth. Let's take a look at some events in the US that were as bad or worse than the events of Tiananmen Square that basically nobody knows about. With World War I out of the way and the Spanish flu being contained, it was time for taking out some anger on black people, a favorite American pastime. In 1921 Oklahoma, in the town of Tulsa, African Americans had built a fairly wealthy community called Greenwood, an extreme rarity at the time,
Tulsa,
nicknamed Black Wall Street. The massacre, known as
I will
the
say it's pretty amazing how little the Tulsa race massacres it's called had been thrown out of the rug. I taught U.S. history, for years, and it never appeared. It did not appear. It really didn't. And it's amazing. I was literally had the curriculum, with me, and the books and history books and stuff. Hadn't heard of it.
Tulsa Race Massacre took place on the night of May 31st and continued into the morning of June 1st, 1921. White residents of Tulsa launched a devastating attack on Greenwood.
Now, I feel like it would have been talked about a lot more had this happened during the civil rights movement. So if this happened in the 50s or 60s, I feel like it would have been a lot more likely to be standard, curriculum. But since it didn't happen before that, Yeah.
Inflammatory coverage in the Tulsa Tribune regarding an alleged rape attempt by a young black man on a white girl that was almost
Trying to see a little bit about why he's
exaggeration of an innocent interaction
talking
or
about it
entirely
in the
fabricated,
context of
both
Tiananmen
which are
Square.
historically common tactics used to justify violence against black people or colonial subjects. Just look at Palestine. Regardless, the economic success of the Greenwood community simply made them a convenient scapegoat. It's also true that historically, this kind of violence against black people, who some whites thought were doing too well for themselves, was common. White mobs, many wearing their World War I army uniforms, set fires throughout the Greenwood district, with the Tulsa police officers joining in on the arson of black businesses.
That area never
along
recovered
Archer Street.
for African
The result
Americans.
was predictably devastating. An estimated 300 dead and over 4,000 black residents who were jailed and placed under armed guard in various locations. The town was put under martial law, and black people, and only black people, were required to carry identity cards, known as green cards, to get around. Greenwood was obliterated. Over 1,000 residences burned, another 400 looted, and countless lives lost. Hey, speaking of the US police state, let's move ahead to 1980s Philadelphia with a radical black group called MOVE. The organization, founded by Vincent Leapart in 1972,
I don't think I've heard of this
was
group.
rooted in a unique blend of black liberation, environmentalism, back-to-nature principles. MOVE members rejected modern technology, instead advocating for a lifestyle that was in harmony with the natural world, whatever that means, which they believed would lead to true freedom and justice. Liberal nonsense for sure, but not deserving what came next by any means. Over time, the group became increasingly militant, leading to numerous confrontations with law enforcement. The police used their unusual lifestyle as an excuse to surveil the group, amongst other violations of their rights. The group's headquarters was
groups were all
located in a row
surveilled
house in
highly.
West Philadelphia, a residential area. Throughout the night,
Where?
headquarters was located in a row house in West Philadelphia, a residential area. Throughout the 1970s and early 80s, MOVE had multiple dramatic encounters with the police.
Just so you know, I was rewinding it because I've been hearing about that. Oh my gosh, can't believe I forgot it. What's that neighborhood in Philadelphia that is like the worst place for just public drug use? Start with a K. I forgot what it is. That's just like horrible. I was wondering about if it came out of that neighborhood too, because apparently it used to be a majorly successful area, except for the last few decades.
Conflicts reached a critical point on May 13, 1985, when after hours of unsuccessful attempts to resolve things peacefully, the police decided to bomb the house occupied by MOVE members, including children. The bomb, dropped from a police helicopter, ignited a fire that quickly spread out of control to neighboring areas. The fire was particularly bad because police prevented fire crews for hours from putting it out. 61 homes in the neighborhood were completely destroyed, with the fire killing 11 people, including 5 children and Vincent Leapart. It remains one of the worst incidents of police violence in U.S. history, though American police are always itching to beat their record.
Can't believe I knew very little about
this. Was 10 minutes of research.
Specifically.
Post-BLM police violence, surveillance, and protest crushing could easily fill an hour of content. American support of protest crushing abroad could fill 10.
I guess he's trying to paint the picture again. Anytime the United States gets involved with anything that's protest related, the United States government, it's default going to be negative. Like it's going to be whatever that protest is, it's going to be something negative.
There's no historical instance in all of Chinese history that compares to the MOVE bombing. The US police and military have been orders of magnitude more violent towards its own citizens advocating for their rights or otherwise living or existing in a way that angered the ruling and privileged classes of their day. Yet these are in no way propagandized internationally, let alone remembered internally, as much as the Tiananmen Square event is in the West. That's my point here. It doesn't make either or okay. I'm just highlighting the hypocrisy of the feigned outrage that happens year in and year out, despite basically no coverage or remembrance of things that happened last week in the grand scheme of things.
It does seem though like a guilty by association thing that he's saying there. If it is associated with the United States State Department in any way, it's by default bad.
The legacy of Tiananmen Square is, unfortunately,
a lot of people do
in the
that,
hands of Western media and governments. They've been pushing the massacre myth. Outlets like the New York Times dutifully spread the myth for the US government, in spite of the facts. The Columbia Journalism Review clearly shows that a lot of the reports about deaths in the square were based on bogus eyewitness accounts. Similar to what happened in Eastern Europe, behind the scenes there was support from the West, and particularly the US, essentially reinforcing the view that whoever doesn't align with American foreign policy and capital must be gotten rid of, no matter what the true will of even the protesters may be. China's economic boom.
I want to hear that again, because this is what I was claiming.
Reinforcing the view that behind the scenes there was support from the West, and particularly the US,
even more.
What happened in Eastern Europe. Behind the scenes, there was support from the West, and particularly the US, essentially reinforcing the view that whoever doesn't align with American foreign policy and capital must be gotten rid of, no matter what the true will of even the protesters may be. China's economic boom softened the West's stance on the country since they could make money there. But the idea that China is especially politically repressive still shapes how the Western world handles diplomacy and business with China. This stands in direct contrast to rogue states like the US and
Well, the
Israel.
thing is, there's a lot of people out there that are, you know, like pro-socialist that do not like a lot of things about the Chinese government. They may like that, you know, their active hand in things like building infrastructure and things like that, and trying to protect workers or whatever. But a lot of people will, in the same instance, will say, okay, I like what China's government's doing in a lot of these senses, and they also will do things like remove corrupt business leaders and things like that. But at the same time, they'll also say, we don't like all the censorship. We don't like some of the civil liberties things. Like, look what's happening to Uyghurs and these like re-education camps and stuff like that. So I've seen plenty of people that socialists and downright communists that are going to say they don't support everything about the Chinese regime.
Which do whatever they want.
So how's he going to tie us to Israel?
China. This stands in direct contrast to rogue states like the US and Israel, which do whatever they want internally as well as on the international stage with zero consequences. So what's the takeaway here? The United States, always lecturing the world on violating sovereignty or human rights, played a significant role in fanning the flames of discontent in China. We don't know yet the full extent, but through propaganda, covert actions, and destabilization efforts, the US followed its tried and true playbook, stoking unrest, then attempting to guide the resulting chaos in its favor.
This is not that hot of a take.
And in many ways did, answer for the violence and the loss of innocent lives. But let's not forget that the mythmaker here has a long and bloody history of doing far, far worse.
For sure.
If we're going to condemn China for the Tiananmen Square incident, then we must equally, if not more, condemn the US for the last 248 years of non-stop colonialism, imperialism, and genocide. Should you be intellectually honest and consistent.
Fair enough.
The best resource list I can recommend for further reading is the Shao Collective Collection, as you see on screen now. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to
Comrade
Nitro,
Comrade Hakim is his name.
Dubs, Kenny, Thomas Ross.
All right, final thoughts. All right, I don't want to rehash everything I was saying during the video, but I guess some summarized thoughts I can get across a little bit. I was wondering about the consistency of his support for movements. The consistency that I guess I did find is that he definitely believes anything the United States has touched when it comes to civil unrest, you know, is going to be negative. Is going to be negative. And whatever. I mean, there's some consistency in there, but I was asking, you know, I wonder if how he feels against something about like the solidarity movement in Poland, which was again going against kind of the communist regime there. But it was also in a lot of ways what people were saying was about socialism. It was about more workers' rights, you know, against a regime that is supposed to be about such things. But also something like the French Revolution. I've heard a lot of people that are, again, very much espousing socialist or communist ideologies that, you know, like love the French Revolution. So would those actions also be seen as consistently good under this, you know, this worldview? So anyway, but I'd like to hear what you guys think about this. The other thing I did want to say is it did seem like he was more about not even necessarily saying the massacre didn't happen. I mean, he definitely was saying maybe it wasn't as bloody as it was, but was more fixated on the fact that it may not have all been it may not have been happening so much in Tiananmen Square itself, but was happening in the surrounding areas. And he argued that that did matter. I don't know if I was really buying that to the extreme that he was. So that's kind of, again, my final thoughts. But I do want to hear from you down below. Thank you for supporting. This video will pretty much, no doubt, I know, get demonetized. So thank you for supporting. If you're able to support through the channel memberships, through Patreon, come hang out with me in a live stream as well. And you can support me that way. So if that's something that you feel like doing, if not, watching the videos is awesome too. All right, with that, we'll see y'all next time. Bye.